This is one of the most eventful and impactful weeks in the investigation of the U.S. Capitol riot. In a legal brief, the U.S. House Select January 6 committee reveals it has a good faith belief former President Trump and his allies engaged in a criminal conspiracy by trying to block Congress from certifying the 2020 election. This is the first time the committee has laid out a potential criminal case against Mr. Trump. In its nearly 200-page filing, the committee says the former president illegally sought to obstruct an official proceeding and, quote, did so corruptly. The committee is trying to obtain records from attorney John Eastman and is arguing the suspected crime overrides Eastman's claim of privilege. Meanwhile, there are breakthroughs in the criminal investigation of the Capitol siege as well. The first criminal trial against an accused rioter is now underway. The son of defendant Guy Roiphe testified against his father, saying Guy Roiphe scared the family with his political rhetoric, including his use of the phrase "rise up" in 2020 in text messages. And prosecutors have secured a guilty plea from accused Oath Keeper Joshua James of Alabama. James admits seditious conspiracy and says Oath Keeper's founder Stuart Rhodes had a plan January 6th. James was accused of being something of a lieutenant for Rhodes on the ground that day. His signed plea deal says Rhodes told conspirators to be prepared if called upon to report to the White House grounds to secure the perimeter and use lethal force if necessary against anyone who tried to remove President Trump. For more, I want to bring in Nikole Killion and Rebecca Roiphe. Nikole is CBS News congressional correspondent, and Rebecca is law professor at New York Law School, and she is a CBS News legal contributor. Let's begin, Nikole, with the January 6th committee revelations. What reaction did you get today from members of Congress to what appears to be a very striking and a very forceful statement from the committee?
Yeah, well, as you referenced, a lot of this information came out of a court filing as the committee has been engaged in this back and forth battle to try to get this conservative lawyer, John Eastman, to turn over emails to the panel. So this by no means was a final report, if you will, but in making the case to get those emails from John Eastman, they did try to make that argument that they believe that there could be some criminal violations there, and that's why it's essential that they get this cooperation from Eastman. And at the end of the day, that really is the committee's primary concern right now. But look, you know what Chairman Benny Thompson told me earlier today is that, you know, they're just following the facts where they lead, which is why they have laid out some of this evidence in this court filing. I think many members of the committee that we talked to today did stress, though, they're not here to play prosecutor. They are not here to, go after people criminally. Ultimately, the committee, if it finds criminal wrongdoing, would refer that to the Justice Department, and that is something that Chairman Thompson reiterated to me earlier today. But what I do think is interesting is that some committee members are saying, look, the Justice Department doesn't necessarily have to wait for us to put out a report to start acting on some of this information. That, in essence, is what Select Committee member Adam Schiff told one of our producers on the Hill earlier today. So I think that is something to watch going forward. The committee obviously is working on a report that it will eventually produce with a more comprehensive look at some of their findings. But, what they are saying is that, if the Justice Department wants to move forward, they certainly can. They don't necessarily have to wait for a report to do that. Also, I would note, in talking to Chair Thompson as well, I asked him if he felt that the former president should be held criminally responsible. And what he told me is that, he feels that anyone who did something illegal with respect to the election and trying to change the outcome of it should be held accountable. And he echoed what we've heard many of these committee members say over time, is that, the president isn't above the law. No one is above the law. So that is kind of the latest state of play here on the Hill. But certainly there were quite a lot of revelations in this court filing, and certainly potentially more to come.
So the committee shows some of its cards and says things in this legal filing it knew would make news. They must very much want these John Eastman records. So, Rebecca, John Eastman, the attorney who wrote the memo detailing the course of action in which former Vice President Pence could stop or impact the Electoral College certification, it seems relevant if he was an attorney for Donald Trump or just an advisor. Explain why that is.
That's absolutely true. It's critical whether or not he was acting as an attorney, because right here he's claiming that the select committee should not have access to his emails because he was giving legal advice to the president, and the president was relying on that advice. That's the attorney-client privilege. But if he was not acting as a lawyer, but rather acting as a political advisor, then that privilege does not attach. The other argument made here is that these memos were never meant to be confidential, which is another requirement for the attorney-client privilege. They were meant to be sent around and advance the president's cause. And finally, there's an exception to the privilege for lawyers who are helping their clients, either knowingly or not, commit illegal acts. And that's why the committee laid out these facts so clearly. Perhaps they might have had, as you were just suggesting, and Nikole was perhaps hinting at, some other alternative notion that they were sending a message to the Department of Justice, but they also, it had a legal purpose, which was to suggest that perhaps there's definitely a prima facie case that this lawyer was assisting in criminal conduct, in which case that privilege no longer applies.
Let's assume for a moment, Nikole, that the committee gets its John Eastman records. Add that to the tidal wave of records they have already, tens of thousands of records, hundreds of witnesses, hundreds of tips from the public. What's the latest you're hearing on the timetable for them putting all this together, producing a report, or producing a hearing?
Well, keep in mind, this is a tidal wave that has been building up over time. The committee has been working for the better parts of 9 months now. We'll soon be coming up on a year, and we do know that they do want to try to button up their investigation just from a timing standpoint, right? Because we're getting ready to head into the midterm elections, and so certainly that is the goal of the committee, certainly before there could be a potential changeover here in Congress, to try to get this work finished if they can. So the latest timetable is that we do know the committee ideally would like to wrap up their depositions, because there are depositions that are ongoing, including today with a former White House Deputy Press Secretary Judd Deere. They would like to wrap up all of these depositions by April 1st. Now, Chairman Thompson said that's a timetable that could slide depending on how things go. You know, they certainly do continue to make progress. We just saw the committee a short time ago subpoena Kimberly Guilfoyle, who was a girlfriend of Donald Trump Jr. and was very involved in former President Trump's campaign, specifically with respect to finances and heading up, that arm of his campaign. And so from that standpoint, there are still a lot of people that this committee wants to talk to, including, the former president's daughter. Potentially, they have flirted with the idea of calling in the former Vice President Mike Pence. So whether or not that can all happen in the next month, I think remains to be seen. But to the extent that they can get a lot of this work done and wrapped up, they would like to ideally start these public hearings that they've been talking about for some time now, perhaps in April. If they can do that, they would then put out some type of interim report, we're hearing, by June. So that is the rough timetable. Of course, we expect some kind of final report would likely come later in the year.
The timetables have already slipped. Initially they were talking about February public hearings, and here we are in March, and there's nothing on the books. So also add that late in the day, the committee subpoenaed Trump world figure Kim Guilfoyle, who had an interrupted meeting with the committee earlier. Now she's facing a subpoena too. Now, Rebecca, the criminal cases are, of course, quite separate from the congressional investigation. What do you make of the speed of the criminal cases? The first trial began this week, and 14 months later, there are about 500 defendants still waiting for trial and still waiting for trial dates.
I think it's frustrating for people on the outside watching how long this takes, but this is actually how it should proceed in a complex case like this, where there are a lot of individual prosecutions that might in some way link up together, or at least have information that could be used in other cases. And so, to follow the law and follow the facts in a complicated case like this, if you're trying to prove conspiracy or criminal intent, particularly corrupt criminal intent, it can take a long time. So, all of the facts that were laid out in this January 6th filing yesterday, those are all facts that, don't need to establish anything like proof beyond a reasonable doubt. So it's just worth remembering that that's a hard standard, it's a tough standard, and it takes a long time to do right, especially in these complex sort of cases.
No, but you're right, there is a lack of patience for some stakeholders on the outside, but in the inside, the assistant U.S. attorneys, defense attorneys say this is how it goes. Rebecca Roiphe, thank you for your time. My teammate, Nikole Killion, thank you as well.